In this lesson, I want to take a look at hook entity property info, which is going to allow us to describe the properties on our entity in more detail to the entity API. We've seen that you can do things like get some automated support for views using the entity API. But in order for it to fully understand all the properties in our entity, we need to describe them. We're going to tell the entity API about our entity's embed code property and what an embed code really is. We're also going to tell it about the created at property and how, even though it looks like a simple integer in the database, it's actually a timestamp and that should be represented as a date in views, for example. So let's go ahead and take a look at implementing hook entity property info and getting a better handle on what our properties really are. In a previous lesson, we looked at adding support for views to our video entity. So now when I go to structure and views, I can click to add a new view, start filling out the form, something like we'll make a list of videos view, and I can choose to show videos, and I'll continue and edit. When I go to add fields to this view, I get a list of all of the various properties that are defined for our video entity. This literally maps to what we've defined in our hook schema for our video entity module. And you can see it says the video created at, duration, embed code. These are all of our fields. Note though, if I were to say add this created at field, I can go ahead and add it, but Views is treating this field as if it's just a simple integer, because that's all it knows from the schema API. What we're going to do is use hook property info to describe this field in more detail. So the views knows that our created at timestamp is actually that, a date timestamp field, and that views should render it as such. I'll cancel that for now. What we're going to be doing is implementing hook property info. There's some decent documentation about this on Drupal.org that kind of explains the basic principles and gives an example of how the entity module has implemented hook property info on behalf of the node module. So that's helpful. I find that the documentation that's with the entity module is probably the best place to get more information about how this all works. So if you take a look at the entity module from contrib, in this entity.api.php file, you can scroll down. There's the documentation for hook entity info. And here's the documentation for hook entity property info. And it gives you a list of all the different keys that we can use to describe the properties for our entity. I'm not going to go through all of these. We'll talk about a few of them in our implementation. One important thing to note here is this type key. This is where we can specify to the entity API the type of data that our property represents. So for example, there's a date here. I can specify that our created at and updated at fields are of the type date. Based on that, the entity API, through its metadata wrappers and some other systems, views for example, can treat that field and its data appropriately. So if we take a look at our implementation here, I'm going to open up our video entity.module file, and I'm going to just start implementing hook entity property info. This hook just returns an array, so we'll start our array and return it. So the property info here is keyed on the entity type, so information about our entity type, which is video. And then we need to describe the properties. So video, and we're going to describe each of the individual properties, kind of like describing fields in the schema API. What I'm going to do, just for some shorthand, is I'm going to assign this by reference to a variable named properties, just so I don't have to type this all out every single time. And then I'm going to go and take a look at our .install file. What I need to do is describe each of the properties in our .install file in this new hook. So ID, name, embed code, created at, updated at, and duration. Let's do ID first. So the key is the name of the field, like so. And then I need to give it a label. This is the human readable label for this property. So we'll call this video ID. And I can give it a description, unique ID of the video. This one is of the type integer. And we're going to tell it which field in our schema definition this relates to. So the entity API is going to make use of all of this information in a couple of different contexts. If I just go back over to our site, and I'm going to clear the cache quick. So I'll open up a new tab and go to the Performance tab. I need to clear the cache so that Views picks up this new property information. But now, when I refresh our view here, and I click to add a new field, you'll actually only see a couple of them listed. The category and rendered video are ones that are not actually properties. They're provided on behalf of our module by the entity API. And then you see right now we've only got one property listed. Because we implemented hook property info, entity API now expects us to define all of the properties. So we've got our video ID, the human readable name, the description that we gave it. If I add it, it'll treat it as an integer. This is not really all that different than before. So I'll leave that as is. You can see though that our created at field that we had previously added is now missing because there's no longer a description of it. Let's add the rest of our fields in hook property info. We've got two other fields that we can add, the name field and the embed code field. The definition here really isn't that different. The key is the name of the property. If someone was to say access our video entity as an object, like so, that key name is the same as that name of the property that somebody would access directly. It also happens to be, in this case, the key that's used in our schema API definition as well. There we got the name. The one difference here is that we're saying that this is a field of type text. And I know that's possible because, again, I looked at the types of data that our entity API can make use of, and text is right here at the top. By doing that, now views, for example, where we treat our name field as a text field, and our embed code field as a text field. So that's those two. What if I wanted to add our created at and updated at fields? The code for doing that is pretty similar. I can do so. I'm just going to paste it in. Same thing. The key is the property name. We can give it a human readable name. The only big difference here is that I'm using the type of date instead of text or integer. If I save that and switch over to our site, I'm going to need to empty the cache again. So it picks up all the new information. When I click refresh, you can see that our created at field is showing again with a title of created date. Now, Views is treating this as a date field, and I can choose a date format, whereas before it was treating it as simply an integer field. So this is a really simple example of using hook property info and where it comes into play in the system. We'll also see it used in the case of metadata wrappers in the next lesson. But effectively what we're doing is telling the entity API about the different properties on our entity, or our custom entity type, so that it knows how to make use of them when implementing these things for other modules on our behalf, like views or rules or token, all the things that the entity module integrates with. We've got one last field that we can add here. We've got our duration field. That duration is actually an integer, so I'll just copy this properties ID field here. I'll add the field name duration, the duration of our video in seconds. We could also define additional properties that aren't necessarily mapped to columns in our database. Say, for example, if we had implemented in our video entity class just a static property, something like in our video entity class, I could add a static property like public type, like so. So now somebody could access that type property of our video entity. If I wanted to describe that to views, I could do the same thing using hook property info and tell it about it. The other place that you'll see this commonly used is when you're creating modules that implement fields. The entity API is smart enough to automatically integrate with all the common field types. So when I add a field to our video entity using the field UI, it's already got its property information added, and I can add those fields in views and deal with them and so forth. But if I'm creating a new custom field type, there are scenarios where I need to do something like add property information for that field as well. I'm not going to get into that example here. That's for a different series. So that's a really simple implementation of hook entity property info, which describes our properties so that the entity API can make better informed choices about how to use the data contained within those properties. Another place that you can see this in action that I find to be really informative is the code that comes with the entity module. If I take a look inside the entity modules directory, there's another subdirectory named modules, and within that, there's all of these files named like book.inc, field.info.inc, node.info.inc. If I open up the node.info.inc file, what I find in here is the entity API implementing hook entity property info on behalf of the node module. Since the node module is in core and entity module is in contrib, this information isn't part of Drupal core for Drupal 7. So the entity module needs to add this more in-depth description of each of the node's properties for the entity API in its own module. This is a great way to see how hook property info works. We've seen the basics like adding an integer field, which would be our node or version ID field. Here's another type of field. IsNew is a Boolean value. You can get even more complicated with fields like, for example, this status field, which the status field is represented in the database as an integer, like 0 or 1, but that status has special meaning. It doesn't just mean the number 1. 1, for example, means this node is published, and 0 means that this node is unpublished. Using this hook entity property info, you could describe that kind of detail to the entity API. You'll also see that there's some additional keys here that we didn't look at in our example. All of our data is fairly primitive data types like integers or text fields. But for more complicated definitions of a property, you may do things like define a setter. So the setter callback function here is the name of a function that the entity API should call if it needs to figure out how to set the value of the specific property. There's also getter callbacks. If the entity API needed to request the value of the status field and you wanted to do some additional processing on the field before that value was returned, you could define a getter callback, which would be the name of a function to use when getting the value for that field. I encourage you to take a look at how the entity module has implemented these property info hooks on behalf of core's entities. It really makes use of the majority of the different data types and all of these various keys like setter callback, permissions, getter callback, and so forth. And it's a great way to learn how this entire system works.